Ask anybody about the national dish of Spain, and I don't think you'd get much hesitation before they said paella. Everybody understands that paella is a traditional dish of Spain. Some people say this is the landscape of Spain in a pan. Now, there's some subtleties to paella. I sort of learned the hard way. One evening in a restaurant that I was working in that had a paella on the menu, a gentleman came in and he said, "Tonight, I've noticed you've had paella. I love paella, so I'm going to order that." And I was so pleased. And he then ate the paella. And when later I checked with him, "How did you like it?" He said, "I didn't care for it very much." And I said, "What was wrong? Can I make it up to you?" He said, "No, it would take me longer to tell you what was wrong with it than what was right with it." So what I learned is that this gentleman ran a restaurant in Los Angeles that cooked nothing but paella. He said, "I'd love to show you how to make paella." And I said, "Well, it's a Saturday night. By the time we've cleaned up, it'll be 11:30. He said, "Great, I'll see you at midnight." And he came back, and we cooked then paella together until about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I want to share a little bit of what I've learned along the way. So already I have some chicken browning in the pan. This is chicken thigh, so it's a little bit forgiving if it's in the heat for a long time. Here's the chicken thighs that I began with. And all I did is I took the thigh bone out, and having taken the thigh bone out, I just cut it into smaller pieces. So maybe I'll cut this into 4, and those could be browned as well. Let me go ahead and put those into the pan, and I'll turn the heat up just a hair. And I'm also going to cook some sausage in here. Let me get rid of this glove. Here is some chorizo, Spanish sausage that's flavored with paprika. And we're going to put some chorizo in there as well. And we'll get that sizzling. And what that will do is it'll cook, but the fat will render out, and I'll have this beautiful fat that I can use to move forward. And this pan is known as a paella, and it lends its name to the finished dish. Just behind the paella is another pan, and in here I've got some vegetables cooking. Onions, peppers, and garlic, and I've cooked them long and slow in olive oil. How long, you might ask? Well, this cooked probably for about 1.25 hours. And it goes by the name sofrito. And this sofrito, because it takes so long, is oftentimes considered to be a kitchen staple. You just make it in large batches in Spain, and you have it on hand so that if you want to begin a paella, instead of waiting for 1 hour, 1.5 hours for this to cook, you take a big dollop of sofrito, and in it goes into the pan. Okay. Now, there's many different kinds of paella. Some people like paella that has pork chops in it, and lobster tails, and mussels, and clams, and shrimp, and on and on. Maybe the first and the oldest version of paella had rabbit and snails. Those were the things that made their way in there. And when more tourists came to Spain, maybe a lobster tail and a pork chop entered in. I'm making mine here with chorizo and chicken, and then we'll add some seafood later on. But what I learned from this gentleman that helped me through my early career with paella was that this is first and foremost a rice dish. And all of these other garnishes are there just to add their savor to the rice. And if you never lose track of that, then I think you understand this dish in a very different way. I've seen paellas that have mint-scented lamb meatballs flavoring the rice. I've seen paellas with wild mushroom and grilled quail. But the one I'm making here is pretty traditional. All right, I'm going to add the sofrito to this pan. And we're going to introduce rice for about 5 people. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and a little bit more for the hungry folks. And I want to coat this rice with the flavorful fat that's in the bottom of this pan. And then we're going to introduce broth. I'm using chicken broth right here, and I've steeped saffron in it. And more than that, I've tasted it, and it's properly seasoned. You want a broth that will not rob flavor from this preparation, but actually add flavor back. Okay? So, we're going to introduce some broth. You can see the beautiful color of the saffron. And now that it's hot, I'm going to turn it down just a hair. And we've got a little bit of time. A little bit of time to take. Initially, this can cook pretty fast, pretty aggressively. So at a nice little simmer like this, I think is entirely appropriate. If I had to guess, we're looking at about 3 parts stock to 1 part rice. That may seem like a lot of liquid for rice, but because there's so much surface area, we'll get a good deal of evaporation. It's always a good idea to have a little bit of stock on hand in case your rice is not quite done. You could add water, but a little bit of extra stock is nice insurance to have. So let's talk about rice for just a second. The rice that I put into this paella is called bomba rice, and I'll put a little bit here. You can see it's short, squat grains. This is a short grain rice, not unlike other short grain rices that you're already familiar with. Among them, arborio rice that you use to make risotto, or the rice used to make sushi. Short grain rice like this tends to cook up very, very starchy. What that will do is it will give us a body to this dish. But I don't want you to stir this endlessly, because if you do, what you can expect is that this paella will become something akin to risotto, and that's not what we want at all. So short grain rices tend to cook up a little bit stickier, but this particular short grain rice, bomba, is great and distinctive because it holds its shape very, very well over the course of its cooking. So searching out that rice, if you're making paella, is a great plan. This arborio rice, which is also a short grain rice, and the grains are probably no more than 2 times as long as they are wide, has a lot of starch, and the Italians capitalize on that starchiness by stirring it constantly while it's cooking and creating a creamy, starchy gravy. Likewise, the Japanese use short grain rice for sushi because they want the rice to stick together into fingers or into logs. As you move from short grain rice into medium grain rice, and this is a jasmine rice, this is about 3 times as long as it is fat, you come up with a rice that cooks up a little bit less sticky. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Turkey, they are famous for pilaf. And they have a particular technique to guarantee that this rice doesn't stick and clump together. The pilaf method. What they do is they take the rice and they parch it in a pan of hot fat. They actually gelatinize the starch on the outside of each grain so that it resists sticking together. They also give it a greasy little overcoat to wear. Each grain has oil on the outside that protects it from sticking to one another. So that is medium grain rice. And then finally, long grain rice. And long grain rice is about 5 times as long as it is fat. Cooks up very fluffy. We tend to like long grain rice in this country, but as you travel around the world, and certainly as you travel around the Mediterranean, you will bump into some of these other varietals. So pay attention. You want to choose the right rice for the dish. And for a paella, the bomba rice is it. If you were making risotto, the arborio rice. If you were making a pilaf, a medium grain rice. And likely now what you have in your pantry, because we like it in this country, is long grain rice. Okay, I'm going to move these rices aside. I'm going to just take a quick look at how things are coming along. This has been cooking pretty aggressively here, and I want to give it a little shake. That's all the stirring you really need to do. Make sure there's no grains of rice sort of on a little lifeboat, which is a piece of chicken. You want all the rice actually down in the cooking liquid. And this little shake lets you know that it's not stuck to the pan. But if it were to stick, typically where you can expect it to stick is right here in the middle. So with your spoon, you can just monitor its progress. This paella is going to cook for about 25 minutes. As the liquid begins to be absorbed, I'll reduce the heat just a little bit. And when it's cooked about halfway, when it's cooked for, let's say, 10, 12 minutes, I'm going to introduce some additional ingredients. Ingredients that don't need to cook for the entire time. So among them, I'm going to add some fresh peas. And I'll scatter those fresh peas in, and they will cook in the boiling liquid. And I will take some shellfish, and what I have here is clams and mussels and shrimp, and I'm going to add those as well. And as they cook, they will open and they'll lend a little bit more liquid to this broth. So you should expect that these will give you a little bit more liquid as well. One subtlety, but I think it's important, when we add these, recognize that there's a hinge on each of these, and you want that hinge to be down so that when it opens, you see what's inside. If I mistakenly put it hinge side up, it would be like me saying, okay, here, enjoy some clams, and then I would hide them from you. And that's not what we want at all. So these will be introduced into the pan with the hinge down. On a mussel, the hinge is on this flat side right here, and I will put them down and let them open up. I would say at this point, we're about halfway through, and so I'm going to introduce some of these peas. Sometimes you'll see green beans added to these. They have a great green bean. I know them as Romano beans, sort of a flat green bean that is used. It's not uncommon to see starchy beans like garbanzos or white beans added to a paella. And just press these peas into the liquid so that they can cook. And then I'm going to take the clams and I'm going to introduce them seam side down or hinge side down right into the pan. Of the three, the shrimp, the mussels, and the clams seem to take longer than the other two. So I really want to start with those. And then the mussels can be introduced. Again, put the seam down. Now, if you have shellfish like this, and you have a clam or a mussel that's gapped open, give it a little squeeze. And if it closes up tight, that tells you that the shellfish is still alive. If, on the other hand, it's gapped open and it stays open, that's indicative of shellfish that's already died, and it can be a little bit dangerous to eat it. So those should be discarded, and certainly never buy shellfish that's already open, because that's problematic. This is nice and tightly closed, so I'm going to tuck that in there. And then these shrimp, I'm going to press into the rice, and I'm going to turn the heat down just a hair. We'll just shake it to make sure it's not sticking yet. But you can see that the rice has absorbed a good deal of the liquid. I want to make sure that none of the rice is sticking up and out of liquid. I want it to have a chance to cook evenly. The clams are just beginning to open. Likewise, the mussels. And the shells will protect them from the heat of the rice below. Now, in terms of monitoring the progress of this rice, you might consider just coming in here and tasting the rice. That's a great way to monitor its progress. But more than that, you might take a single grain or two of rice and bite into the grain. And if you see a chalky core, that is indicative of rice that hasn't fully cooked yet. I would say we're about 5 minutes away from this being done. While we're waiting for this paella to cook, one great little treat from Spain is serrano ham. And there's a little confusion surrounding serrano because it's similar in some ways to prosciutto, and it's also similar to a new ham that's beginning to show up on the market called iberico ham. Now, iberico takes your breath away, not just because it's tasty, but because it can run about $50 a pound. And when you compare that to serrano ham, you say, what makes it worth the difference? Well, there's a couple of things. There are different breeds of pigs. So the serrano is made from a commercial breed of pig that is fed grain throughout its life. It comes to maturity relatively quickly, usually within 15 to 20 months, something like that, maybe even a little bit less. Whereas the iberico ham, it's a much larger hog and it's completely black, is foraged in the wild on acorns. And it takes 2, sometimes 3 times as long to come to maturity. It puts on a lot more fat, but because of the added time, it costs more. This is a serrano ham right here. And I've got it in a little rack. I've trimmed away any fat that was discolored because it ages for a good deal of time. And you want to be careful to take any fat that maybe has oxidized and get rid of that. And what we're going to do is just begin the process of slicing this ham just very, very thinly, and then move it over to a plate. Oftentimes in Spanish restaurants, they have someone doing this table side or bar side. The nice thing about doing it yourself is there's ready access to snacks. You want to slice this as thin as you can. And likely when you go to the store, they will take a piece of this and just put it on the deli slicer. And once it's on the deli slicer, then they can slice it as thin as you'd like. I would just make sure that they slice it very, very thin, as thin as they can get it and still have it hold together. That's sort of the rule of thumb. Now, I can't imagine, unless you're a person who likes to have ham every single day, that you would ever buy a whole ham like this. But I would encourage you to get some serrano ham, and maybe you offer it up early on in the meal with a glass of sherry or white wine, a few olives, some bread, so that people have something to nosh on while the paella is busy cooking. So just a few more pieces, and then we're going to look in on that paella and see how we're doing. Now, you can see that all the shellfish has opened. The shrimp are cooked. If they're not cooked, you can flip them over so that the second side has ready access to the heat. But the clams and the mussels are all open. They need some convincing. You can do that. And there's a subtlety that I'd like to share with you about paella. People who know paella, when it comes to the table, one of the first things they will do is they'll dig down right here in the center, because it's desirable for the rice to get dry on the bottom and then begin to cling to the pan and brown just a little bit. And the way to make that happen, once the rice is cooked, is to turn the heat up a little bit higher and just let that crust form on the bottom. Watch it like a hawk. You don't want it to burn. You don't want it to blacken, just a little bit golden, and that should be about right. You can see it's still moist because as I move this back and forth, it moves independently of the pan. But with the heat up very, very quickly, that bottom will dry out and it'll begin to brown just a little bit. I'm going to begin the process of arranging things just a little bit. I'm going to set these shrimp so that they stand up and take notice. I'll tuck them in like this so that their tails rise up and out of the paella. I'm going to chop some parsley. And we can sprinkle a little bit of parsley on here. I love to garnish this with lemon, and usually I just tuck it in around the edges and let people squeeze it on themselves. And by warming it slightly, it gives up its juice that much quicker. Now, there was a change in the way this sounded. And you notice I shake it and it doesn't move independently of the pan. That's because we're starting to develop that delicious crust. From this point forward, we want to be a little bit careful. So you can monitor the progress of that just by looking down in here. It hasn't burnt yet, but it is starting to stick to the bottom of the pan. This is exactly what you want. But you need to be in charge of this. Don't let it happen by accident. If you ever smell it burning, you smell sort of burnt rice, toasty rice, or if you see smoke coming out of here, obviously those are two clues that you needed to pay a little bit more attention. Not moving any longer, and I can feel that this has just begun to stick on the bottom, just begun to stick. So we'll give it one more minute, and then I'm going to declare this done. In that minute, we can come in here and just taste to make sure we're happy with the flavor of the rice. It's beautifully cooked. If you listen carefully, and I'll quiet down, but if you listen carefully, you can hear the rice grains frying. It pops a little bit. And that is what's going to give you that wonderful crust on the bottom. We'll put our ham down. I'm going to turn the heat off here. And one of the nice things about this particular pan is it's got these wonderful little handles, silicone handles that I can just put on there, and I can move the pan from the stove top right to the table. I'm going to introduce just a little bit of lemon juice. Okay, with our paella done, I'm going to bring some wine over. If you like white wine, likely it's white wine that you would drink with paella. If you like red wine, it also tastes great, lighter, fruitier reds. And maybe the best compromise I can think of is a rosé. So you begin the meal with a little serrano ham, and we move on to the paella. And start with the rice and the chicken. Make sure that everybody gets the clams and the mussels and the shrimp. And just so that they can squeeze a little bit of lemon onto their own taste, we'll add some lemon to the plate as well. Before we leave this, let me just show you one other thing. This is a related dish to paella. This is called fideo. And fideo has in it a lot of the same components of a paella, except instead of being made with rice, it's made with noodles. This one has sausage and peppers and a chicken stock that goes over the top. Oftentimes, it's finished with a little bit of cheese. But It's a delicious dish, and I thought you might like to know about it. And so I'm going to add that to this little montage as well. So, national dish of Spain. Don't get too caught up on all the different things that go into the rice. Pay attention to the rice itself. Make sure that it gets a little crispy on the bottom. Make sure that you add those things that don't require so much cooking a little bit later in the cooking time. And from start to finish, in about 25 or 30 minutes, you can have a delicious paella on the table for your friends to enjoy. So paella is really a full meal, but you might want to have a little salad to enjoy along with the paella, and maybe before the paella, some little appetizer that you could enjoy with a glass of sherry. So I'm going to show you two separate dishes, a marinated olive and a roasted vegetable salad called escalivada. Take a look at the vegetables I have here. Eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, and onions. What I would have you do is toss those in olive oil and pop them into the oven at about 400 degrees until this looks like that. Now, as you take a peek here, all of these vegetables should be a little bit charred, caramelized, and they should have collapsed. They should be very, very tender. One thing I want to encourage you to do is capture this delicious liquid that comes off of all these vegetables. It would be a shame to waste that. And so I'm just going to put it here into a bowl. There we go. So we'll set that aside for right now. And what do we do with these vegetables? Well, take a look. This eggplant, as I said, is very, very soft. And what I might do is cut the skin open and then just spread it out like this. And if it has a lot of seeds, what you might want to do is just pull some of those seeds out and discard them. Really what you're after is the flesh. A few seeds more or less among friends, not a big deal, but it's a nice subtlety to at least make the effort to take them out. And then with forks, you can just shred this meat and separate it from the skin. And that's what I have right over here. The pepper should be able to be peeled pretty easy. Watch how quickly and easily this blackened skin comes off. Certainly don't try and do this while they're hot, but once it's cooled a little bit, it comes off pretty easily. And what I would have you do is what I've done here. Take the peppers and just cut them into strips. The onions have not even been peeled, so we'll take the worst of the black away, just like that. And the onions can be cut up. I like to cut them after I've taken off the root and the stem end, and cut them just into slices like this. Of all these vegetables, the onions will probably take the longest. And so I'll put those right there. And then finally, the tomatoes, likewise, their skin comes off. And usually I just chop it a little bit into a really coarse puree, just like that. All right, so what are we going to do with these vegetables? Well, I'll show you. Here is a plate, and I want to take some of these vegetables. We'll start with some eggplant here, and I'm going to line it up, just shred it a little bit and line it up. And then pay attention to color. I think next I want to put some of these beautiful tomatoes on, and we'll create a little row of tomatoes, and then some of these nice onions, just like that. I've got peppers that have been roasted and sliced thin. And you can carry on this way depending on how big your platter is. and more onions here, and maybe just a little bit more eggplant. Now, these vegetables are, up to this point, undressed, and so we're going to take care of that now. Here's the liquid that I poured off, the roasting liquid. This is tomato juice and eggplant juice. I'm going to add to that some sherry vinegar, and I'm going to add some olive oil. I'm going to season these vegetables with salt and pepper. Here we go. And I'm going to stir this oil and vinegar together with the roasted eggplant juice and the tomato juice, and we'll spoon that right over the top. And this can sit very happily for an hour or so before your meal is ready to go. And just to brighten it up, a little bit of chopped parsley. And that's all there is to escalivada. This is a great brunch dish. Sometimes I have it with a poached egg or as a salad the way we're having it right now, and any leftovers taste great on a sandwich. So there's our salad. Now let's talk about our olives. I've got some olives here, and in this pan I have some orange juice, probably the juice of 2 oranges that's been reduced down to a syrup. And in there I'm going to add some garlic and some thyme, and if you like, pepper flakes, a few pepper flakes. And I'm just going to reconstitute this a little bit. And so that it tastes more of orange than just the reduced orange juice, I'm going to put the zest of 1 orange in here. And I've got a great little tool, maybe you know it, a microplane. It was originally a woodworking tool, and then the cooks discovered it, and history has never been quite the same. This does a great, great job of taking zest and grating chocolate and nutmeg and cheese, so on and so forth. All right. So I'm going to take and put these olives, these are packed in a little bit of olive oil, right into that marinade, and we'll toss them all together and warm them just slightly. And at the same time, I'm going to add some parsley to this. Now, maybe you've never thought of it before, but warming olives, especially when they're marinated, brings out a tremendous amount of flavor. They actually get really fun to eat. So I think it's a great idea to marinate them ahead. They can live happily in the refrigerator for 2, 3, 4 weeks. But before you serve them, bring them out first to room temperature and then pop them into a saute pan like this and put them into the oven until they sizzle, just the way you hear them sizzling now. And then we'll serve them up hot. And I would say, with a glass of sherry, this is a great way to start your meal. And then you move on to the paella, and you've got the escalivada for people that want a little bit of a salad on the side. A simple meal. A main dish meal that's 1 pan, the paella. It takes its name from the pan that it's cooked in. A simple salad on the side, a glass of sherry and some olives, and I think you could do worse than sitting down to that meal and enjoying the taste of Spain, enjoying the landscape of Spain captured in 1 big pan.